There is a particular kind of ruin that history reserves for the very old and the very great. Not the sudden ruin of the conqueror who overreaches and is destroyed in a season, but the slow, courteous, almost invisible ruin of a house that has been at the center of things for so long that it can no longer imagine a world arranged differently. Such a house does not fall. It thins. Its rooms grow colder, its ceremonies grow longer, its portraits grow more numerous, and its children fewer. Until one morning a clerk in a provincial office writes down that the estate has been transferred to the state, and no one thinks to ring a bell. At the height of their power, this family held more of the map of Europe than any dynasty before or since. Their marriages redrew borders that armies had failed to move. Their inheritance stretched from the Atlantic coast of Spain to the plains of Hungary, from the herring fleets of the Low Countries to the silver mountains of the New World. For nearly 4 centuries, the crown of the Holy Roman Empire sat, almost without interruption, on the head of one of their men. And yet the story that survives them is not a story of triumph. It is a story about what it costs to be born into the center of a great structure, and what happens to the people inside it when the structure begins to give way. The name of the family was Habsburg. This channel makes documentaries on the great dynasties of old money, the fortunes, the houses, the marriages, and the long declines. Subscribe if these are the stories you like. New episodes appear every week. They began, as most of Europe's great houses began, with a stone tower on a hill. The tower stood above the valley of the river Aare in what is now northern Switzerland, and it was raised in the 1620s of the last millennium, in the 1020s that is, when the German lands were a patchwork of counts and abbots and the imperial crown was still an object that could be argued about. The tower was called the Habsburg, the Hawk's Castle, and the family that held it took the name of the building rather than the other way around. This is worth pausing over. Most dynasties name their houses after themselves. This one was named after a fortress, and for the next 900 years, its members would be defined, more than by any personal quality, by the properties they held and the properties they married. For 200 years, they were nobody in particular. Counts among counts. They collected valleys, advowsons, tolls, the rights to certain bridges. They served the emperors of the day and outlived them. And then, in the second half of the 13th century, an accident of imperial politics lifted them out of obscurity so completely that the family never entirely believed it had been an accident. The empire had gone for years without a settled head. The great electors, weary of powerful candidates, looked about for a man strong enough to restore order and weak enough not to threaten them. In 1273 they found him, a middle-aged Swabian count named Rudolf, of the House of Habsburg, a competent soldier with a long face and no dangerous ambitions that anyone could detect. He was elected king of the Romans in the autumn of that year and crowned at Aachen, in the Cathedral of Charlemagne, a few weeks later. The electors had misread him entirely. Rudolf's chief rival was Ottokar, king of Bohemia, who during the years of confusion had helped himself to Austria, Styria, Carinthia, and Carniola, and who regarded the election of a minor Swabian count as an insult that required no answer. Rudolf gave him 5 years to reconsider. Then, on a broad plain east of Vienna, near the village of Dürnkreuz, in 1278, the two armies met in one of the largest cavalry engagements the medieval center of Europe would see. Ottokar's line broke. Ottokar himself was killed in the rout. What followed was the single most consequential act of housekeeping in the family's history. Rudolf did not add the conquered duchies to the imperial domain, where they would have been fought over by his successors. He gave them to his sons. Austria became a Habsburg possession, and the family's center of gravity slid 300 miles east, from a tower above a Swiss river to the banks of the Danube, where it would remain until the 20th century arrived to remove it. They did not hold the imperial crown continuously at first. The electors, having learned their lesson, spent the next century and a half handing it about among rivals. But the Habsburgs had acquired something better than a crown, a hereditary block of land in the center of Europe, and a talent, patient, unglamorous, and in the end more effective than any army, for acquiring more of it by marriage. The motto that summarizes the method was not coined by the family, but it stuck to them like a signature, and it was fair. Let others wage war, You happy Austria, Mary. The perfect illustration arrived in the person of Maximilian, the son of Emperor Frederick III, a young man of enormous energy and chronic debt, who in 1477 married the richest heiress in Europe. Her name was Mary of Burgundy, and she had inherited a catastrophe. Her father, Charles the Bold, had spent his life trying to weld his scattered Burgundian territories into a kingdom, and had been killed that January in the snow outside Nancy. The Duchy of Burgundy itself was claimed by the King of France. The wealthy towns of Flanders and Brabant were minded to bargain rather than obey. And Mary, at 19, had a treasury with nothing in it and an army she could not pay. She pawned her jewels to raise loans. She resisted French pressure to marry the boy who would become Charles VIII, and married Maximilian instead. It was a love match. By the standards of the trade, the letters that survive are warmer than the era required, and it lasted less than 5 years. In 1482, out hawking near Waynendale, Mary's horse stumbled and came down on top of her. She lingered for some days, in great pain, and used the time to dictate a long and careful will. She was 25 years old. Her son inherited, and her son's marriage completed what her own had begun. He was called Philip the Handsome, and in the 1490s he was married to Joanna, daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, a match arranged as a routine piece of diplomacy against France, at a moment when Joanna stood third or fourth in line to her parents' thrones and nobody expected her to inherit anything at all. Then her brother died, then her elder sister died, then her sister's small son died. And a Habsburg archduke, almost by clerical error, found himself king consort of Castile, with the whole apparatus of the new Spanish monarchy, its armies, its ports, its unimaginable American silver, attached to the family by a single thread of marriage contract. Philip did not live to enjoy it. He died at Burgos in 1506, aged 28, after an afternoon's exercise and a cold drink of water. The physicians said fever, and the court said poison, and no document has ever settled the question. His widow Joanna is remembered by the name her enemies gave her, Juana la Loca, Joanna the Mad, a description assembled after the fact by the men who had every reason to want a queen declared incapable of ruling. Her father shut her up, then her son shut her up. She spent the last 46 years of her life confined in the town of Tordesillas, in a set of rooms overlooking a convent wall, and she died there in 1555, still in law, Queen of Castile. She was the last of the line to be treated as an inconvenience rather than an institution. What her marriage had produced was something the family had never had and would never quite recover from. A boy born at Ghent in 1500 who would inherit 4 separate patrimonies at once, and who would spend his entire adult life discovering that this was not a blessing. His name was Charles, and he was the first man in European history who could truthfully say that the sun did not set on his possessions. From his father, he had the Burgundian Netherlands, Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, the richest concentration of urban wealth north of Italy. From his mother, he had Castile and Aragon, and with them Naples, Sicily, Sardinia, and the whole widening business of the Americas, Cortez in Mexico, Pizarro in Peru, the treasure fleets, the mines. From his paternal grandfather, he had the Austrian duchies. And in 1519, the electors, who had by then been thoroughly bought, gave him the imperial crown as well. He was 19. He spoke French at home, Spanish in council, and German badly, which his German subjects never forgot. He also, from the beginning, governed by proxy, and the proxies are the part of this reign that the paintings leave out, because they were women. The richest and most difficult of his territories, the Netherlands, was governed for 40 years by 2 Habsburg archduchesses in succession. The first was his Aunt Margaret, a woman who had been married 3 times by the age of 24, and widowed twice and returned as cargo each time, and who declined a 4th marriage in order to take up the regency instead. She held the 17 provinces together through war, plague, and municipal revolt. Negotiated with the King of France's mother a peace that both sides ratified without their sons having to concede anything in public, and brought up her nephew Charles herself. The second was his sister Mary, widowed at 21 when her husband was killed fighting the Ottomans in Hungary, who never remarried and governed the Netherlands for 24 years. She raised armies, fortified the frontier, quarreled with her brother about money as a matter of routine, and when he abdicated, she resigned on the same day, saying that she had had enough of governing on behalf of men who had never come to look at what they owned. She was one of the great collectors of the age, and her pictures are hanging in Madrid and Vienna now. Neither of them could inherit anything in her own name. Both of them ran, for a working lifetime, the most valuable province in the empire. That combination, a family which excluded women from succession and depended on them for administration, was not a contradiction the Habsburgs ever noticed. It went on for 400 years. The picture the age liked to paint of him was of a young man striding across a map. The truth was closer to a lifetime spent on horseback and shipboard, moving between crises that could not be delegated because there was no one to delegate them to. He crossed the Mediterranean and the Alps and the North Sea again and again. He fought the King of France for a generation over Italy and settled nothing. He fought the Ottoman advance up the Danube and settled nothing there either. And at home in the German lands, he faced the one thing his inheritance had not prepared him for, a monk in Wittenberg who had raised a question about indulgences and would not withdraw it. Charles heard Martin Luther in person at Worms in 1521 and declared against him, and spent the next 30 years discovering that a religious argument cannot be won by an emperor with an army, because the army has to be paid, and the money comes from the towns, and the towns are where the argument is being held. There is a scene near the end of his life that says more about the family than any battle. In the Great Hall of the Palace at Brussels, in the autumn of 1555, Charles came in leaning on the shoulder of a young Prince of Orange, because his gout had reached the stage where he could not walk unaided, and told the assembled estates of the Netherlands that he was giving it up. He had sought the imperial crown, he said, not in order to rule over a multitude of kingdoms, but to keep the peace of Christendom. He had made many journeys and waged many wars, and had hoped for a great deal, and very little of it had come to pass. His strength was gone. He asked them to trust his son. He signed away Spain the following January. He sent the imperial title east to his brother Ferdinand, and with it the Austrian lands, a division that split the family permanently into a Spanish branch and an Austrian one, and set the shape of European politics for the next 200 years. Then he sailed for Spain and settled beside a monastery at Yuste in Extremadura, in a small house of 8 rooms built against the church wall, with a door from his bedchamber to the sanctuary so that he could hear Mass without rising. He kept 50 servants. He read the dispatches. He ate more than his physicians allowed and paid for it. And on the 21st of September, 1558, malaria finished what the gout had begun. He was 58 years old, and he had been, by any measurement anyone has been able to devise, the most powerful man alive. He had also been the last Habsburg who could look at the family's possessions and see a single object. After him there were 2 houses, and the elder of them was already carrying the seed of its own extinction. The Spanish branch is the part of the story that everyone half knows and almost nobody has been told properly. For 150 years, it was the dominant power on earth. Charles's son Philip II inherited Spain, the Netherlands, half of Italy, and the Americas at 28, and governed all of it for 42 years from a desk. That is not a figure of speech. He built a palace monastery in the mountains north of Madrid, a gray granite rectangle called the Escorial, half royal residence and half mausoleum, with the church at its center and the king's bedroom opening onto the high altar exactly as his fathers had at Yuste, and there he read, annotated, and returned the dispatches of an empire that took 4 months to answer him. He is the first modern head of state in the sense that matters, a man who understood his possessions primarily as paper. He married 4 times, buried 4 wives, and outlived most of his children. His eldest son, Don Carlos, was unstable in a manner the court found first embarrassing and then dangerous. Philip had him confined in his own apartments in the winter of 1568, and the young man died there 6 months later, at 23. What exactly happened has been argued over for 4 centuries, and the argument has been fed by the fact that the Spanish court destroyed the record. It is worth noting only that a Habsburg heir being shut into a room by his own family was, by then, not without precedent, and would not be the last time. Under Philip and his successors, the Spanish Empire produced the greatest run of art in European history and went quietly bankrupt 4 separate times. The silver came in from Potosi and went straight out again to German and Genoese bankers to service loans raised against the next year's silver. The Armada sailed in 1588 and did not come back. The Dutch provinces fought for 80 years and won. And in Madrid, in the middle of the 17th century, a court painter named Velázquez was producing the portraits by which the dynasty is now chiefly recognized. Small, pale, magnificently dressed children standing very still in dim rooms, painted with an honesty that no one seems to have objected to at the time, and which reads today like a diagnosis. Because through all of it, the family did the one thing that its whole method depended on. It married to keep property inside the house. Uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin. Again and again and again, across 4 generations, on the theory, perfectly sound in law and perfectly disastrous in biology, that the surest way to prevent an inheritance from leaving the family was never to let anyone else into it. The result was a king named Charles II of Spain, born at Madrid in 1661, who could not chew properly, who was not taught to read until late, whose health failed him for reasons physicians of the day could not name, and modern ones have argued about ever since. He was crowned as a small boy under his mother's regency. One historian wrote of him that from the day of his birth they were waiting for his death. They waited 38 years. He married twice and had no children. And on the 1st of November, 1700, in the Alcazar in Madrid, the last Habsburg king of Spain died, leaving a will that handed the entire Spanish Empire, Spain itself, the Netherlands, Naples and Milan, the Americas, the Philippines, to a French prince, the grandson of Louis XIV. His Austrian cousins had expected to inherit it. What they got instead was the War of the Spanish Succession, 13 years of fighting from the Danube to Gibraltar, which ended with a Bourbon on the Spanish throne and an exhausted Vienna consoled with the southern Netherlands in a share of Italy. The Spanish Habsburgs were gone. They had ruled the largest empire in the world for 200 years, and their line ended because they had loved their own blood too exclusively to let it be diluted. The Austrian branch was luckier only in degree, and for a while it looked like the opposite. The generation that fought that war had come out of a genuine catastrophe. In 1683, an Ottoman army had stood outside the walls of Vienna for 2 months. The emperor had left the city, and the relief that broke the siege arrived from Poland at the last plausible hour. What followed was the most successful half-century in the dynasty's military history, conducted almost entirely by a small, ugly, brilliant Savoyard prince named Eugene, whom the French court had rejected as unfit for a commission, and who spent the rest of his life demonstrating the error. He drove the Ottomans out of Hungary. He beat the French in Italy and Bavaria. He built himself a palace on the southern slope above Vienna and filled it with books and pictures and a menagerie. And when he died, the family found it had a Hungarian kingdom. It had not governed for 150 years and no very clear idea what to do with it. This was the moment at which the Habsburgs began to build in the way that people now go to Vienna to look at. The Baroque churches, the abbeys along the Danube, the long yellow facades, the summer palace at Schönbrunn, laid out to rival Versailles and never quite finished as designed because the money ran out. All of it belongs to the 2 or 3 decades after the Turkish Wars, when the dynasty felt itself vindicated by heaven and was borrowing accordingly. And then, 40 years after Charles II died in Madrid, the Austrian line ran out of men as well. The Emperor Charles VI had spent almost his entire reign on a single problem. He had no son. He had a daughter, and he wanted her to inherit, and the law of the German lands did not obviously allow it. So he drafted a family statute called the Pragmatic Sanction, which declared the Habsburg possessions indivisible and settled them in default of a male heir on his eldest daughter. And then he spent 27 years traveling, bargaining, bribing, and conceding in order to get the other powers of Europe to sign it. He gave away trade concessions. He gave away territory. He gave away leverage he would never recover. Every one of them signed, almost every one of them broke it within months of his funeral. The daughter was 23 years old. Her name was Maria Theresa, and she was born in Vienna on the 13th of May, 1717, 6 months after the death of the infant brother, whose survival would have made her irrelevant. Her education had been the ordinary education of an archduchess. Languages, dancing, painting, a great deal of religion, some singing. She had a fine voice, and almost nothing about taxation, the army, or the constitutional arrangements of the Hungarian nobility. Her father, who had spent his life securing her inheritance, had never once brought her into the council chamber. When he died in October 1740, she inherited a treasury that was empty, an army that was underpaid and scattered, a chancellery of elderly men who had served her father since before she was born, and a document signed by all Europe promising to leave her alone. Within weeks, the King of Prussia marched into Silesia, the richest province she had, the one with the textile towns and the tax base, on the theory that a young woman who had just buried her father would not fight for it. She fought for it for 8 years. When the Bavarians and the French moved in from the west and Vienna itself looked untenable, she went to Pressburg and stood before the Hungarian Diet, a body famous for extracting concessions from every monarch who had ever needed it, and asked for an army. She got one. She lost Silesia in the end and tried twice more to get it back and failed. And it is the measure of the woman that this is the least interesting thing about her reign. What she did instead was rebuild the machine. She created a central administration where there had been a collection of provincial understandings. She reformed the tax system so that the nobility and the church paid into it, which no Habsburg had managed before. She founded military academies and a medical faculty, made primary schooling compulsory in principle, if not yet in fact, and abolished judicial torture. She was a strict Catholic, deeply intolerant of other confessions in a way that her admirers have never been able to argue away, and she was the most effective ruler her family produced in 600 years. She did all of it while pregnant or recovering from being pregnant for 18 consecutive years. 16 children, 10 of them lived to adulthood. She had married for love, genuinely, and against the general expectation of her class, a Lorraine Duke named Francis Stephen, whom she had known since she was 6 and married in 1736, and whom she made co-regent and then arranged to have elected Holy Roman Emperor, and who was, by all accounts, a pleasant, unfaithful, financially gifted man who left the governing to his wife and made a fortune speculating on the side. When he died in 1765, she cut off her hair, put on black, and wore it for the remaining 15 years of her life. She had the room in which she received the news measured and remeasured. She counted in a private notebook the years, months, and days of her marriage. It is one of the few entirely unguarded things she left behind. Her children she treated as instruments, which is what children of a reigning house were for. Joseph, the eldest, became co-regent and spent his mother's last years arguing with her about everything. He was the pure product of the Enlightenment, impatient, doctrinaire, convinced that a serf could be freed and a monastery closed by decree. She thought him a man who would break what he could not persuade. He proved her right after her death, and most of his reforms were reversed within a decade of his own. The daughters went out as treaty clauses: Maria Carolina to Naples, Maria Amalia to Parma, Maria Christina, the favorite, the one permitted to marry for affection, to Saxe-Teschen, and the youngest, at 14, went to France. She had been an indifferent pupil, this one. Her mother's letters to her ambassador in Paris are full of instructions about her reading, her posture, her failure to write regularly, her frivolous friends. The girl was called Maria Antonia at home and Marie Antoinette at Versailles, and she was, in the end, the price of an alliance that reversed 200 years of enmity between the Habsburgs and the Bourbon and lasted rather less than one generation. Maria Theresa did not live to see what became of her. She died at Vienna on the 29th of November, 1780, at 63, after catching cold at a hunt and refusing for 3 weeks to stay in bed. She had put her papers in order herself. She had written out her final bequests in her own hand, including a month's pay for the soldiers. 13 years later, in October 1793, Her youngest daughter was tried by a revolutionary tribunal in Paris and executed. She was 37. Her nephew, by then the Emperor Francis, made no serious attempt to save her. There had been an approach from the French side about an exchange, and Vienna had not been willing to pay what was asked. The family had spent 900 years acquiring the habit of thinking in terms of the house rather than the person, and the habit did not lapse merely because the person was an aunt. Another daughter of the house had gone in another direction entirely, and her story is worth a sentence because it shows how far the marriages reached. A granddaughter of Maria Theresa, an archduchess named Maria Leopoldina, sailed for Rio de Janeiro in 1817 to marry the heir to the Portuguese throne, and found herself 5 years later empress of a newly independent Brazil, a Habsburg presiding over a tropical court on the far side of the Atlantic, writing home to Vienna about butterflies and mineral specimens and the impossibility of the climate. But by then the house at the center of Europe was fighting for its existence against a man who had made himself an emperor without any ancestors at all. The Emperor Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire, and later by a piece of legal engineering, Francis I of Austria, was Maria Theresa's grandson, and he had the misfortune to reign for 43 years, almost all of them in the shadow of Napoleon Bonaparte. He was beaten at Marengo and Hohenlinden. He was beaten at Austerlitz in the freezing December of 1805, in what remains the most complete defeat an Austrian army ever suffered. While Napoleon slept in the Habsburg summer palace at Schönbrunn, and the imperial family fled east. He was beaten again at Wagram 4 years later, and Napoleon slept at Schönbrunn again. And then, on the 6th of August, 1806, in a proclamation of a few dry paragraphs, Francis laid down the crown of the Holy Roman Empire and released every state and official from their oaths to it. It is difficult to convey how strange that document is. The institution he dissolved was 1,000 years old. It had been founded, in its own understanding, by Charlemagne. It had survived the investiture controversy, the Reformation, the 30 Years' War. Its crown had sat on Habsburg heads, almost without a break, since 1440, and it ended not in a battle but in a chancery, with a clerk's fair copy, because the alternative was to let Napoleon take the title for himself. 4 years later, the emperor gave Napoleon his daughter. Marie-Louise was 18. Her upbringing had been an unbroken education in loathing the French. Her great-aunt had died on a scaffold in Paris. Her family had twice fled Vienna ahead of French cavalry. And in 1810, she was married by proxy in the Augustinian church and sent west to a husband of 40 who wanted an heir with old blood in him. She provided one within the year, a boy who was proclaimed King of Rome at birth, and who, after his father's fall, was brought back to Vienna, stripped of the French title, given an Austrian one, and raised in the palace of his grandfather as the Duke of Reichstadt. He was tuberculous, and he died at Schönbrunn in 1832, aged 21, in a room not far from the one where Napoleon had slept in triumph 27 years before. His mother came from Parma to sit with him for his last month. The empire she was born into had by then acquired the shape it would keep until the end. A Catholic, multilingual, deeply conservative state stretching from the Alps to the Carpathians, governed from Vienna by the machinery Maria Theresa had built in the political instincts of Prince Metternich, whose entire philosophy could be reduced to a single proposition, that any change anywhere was the beginning of a change everywhere. That proposition was tested in 1848, when revolution came to Vienna, Budapest, Prague, Milan, and Venice within the space of a few months. Metternich fled to England in a laundry cart, or so the story goes. The Emperor Ferdinand, a gentle, epileptic man who has been mocked for 2 centuries and who deserved better, was persuaded by his family to abdicate. His brother stood aside as well, and on the 2nd of December, 1848, in the Archbishop's palace at Olmütz, the crown passed to an 18-year-old. He had been born at Schönbrunn on the 18th of August, 1830, and his name was Franz Joseph, and he would reign for 68 years. He began it, as the men around him intended, with severity. The Hungarian Revolution was still in the field when he took the crown, and it was not put down by Austrian arms alone. It took a Russian army invited in by Vienna to finish it in the summer of 1849. The reprisals that followed were thorough, and they were remembered in Hungary long after the men who ordered them were dead. Northern Italy was held down by the same methods. The young emperor's name became, in half his own territories, the name of the officer who had signed the order. 4 years later, a Hungarian journeyman with a knife got within a foot of him on the walls of Vienna and failed only because the blade caught on the stiff collar of his uniform tunic. The church built to give thanks for the escape, the votive Kirche, paid for by public subscription from every province, is still one of the largest buildings on the ring. He was 23. He would survive everyone who plotted against him and outlive most of the states that produced them. The reign is so long that it is difficult to hold in the mind. When it began, Europe was still arguing about the settlement Napoleon had left behind, and troops moved by road. When it ended, there were aeroplanes over the Alps and machine guns on the Isonzo. He outlived Metternich, Bismarck, and Queen Victoria. He signed his correspondence standing at a plain desk in an unheated room, rising at 3:30 in the morning, and he went on doing it into his 80s. What is harder to convey is the emptiness at the center of it. Franz Joseph was not a cruel man and not a stupid one, but he had been raised by his mother, the Archduchess Sophie, a Bavarian princess of formidable will who had engineered his accession and never afterwards let go of him, to believe that his single duty was to preserve, unaltered, what he had been handed. He did not innovate. He did not delegate. He read every file, and he presided decade by decade over the steady subtraction of his own inheritance. Lombardy went in 1859. Venetia went in 1866, in the same summer that Prussia broke Austrian primacy in the German lands for good at Königgrätz, a defeat which meant that when a German empire came into being 5 years later, it was made in Berlin, and the Habsburgs, who had been the German dynasty for 4 centuries, were not in it. And in 1867, to hold what was left, he agreed to the compromise. The empire was divided into 2 halves, Austrian and Hungarian, with 2 parliaments, 2 governments, and 1 monarch in common. He was crowned King of Hungary in the Matthias Church in Buda that June, with his wife beside him. Her presence there was not decorative. Of all the political acts of Elizabeth's life, the Hungarian settlement is the one that was genuinely hers. She had learned the language properly, which almost no one at the Viennese court had bothered to do. She had surrounded herself with Hungarian ladies and read Hungarian literature and made no secret of preferring Budapest to Vienna. And in the years of negotiation, she pressed her husband, in letters that survive, to deal with the Hungarian leadership directly and generously. The Hungarians understood exactly what they had in her and returned it. She remained until her death and long after more genuinely loved in Hungary than any Habsburg had been in 300 years. The nation gave the imperial couple a country house at Gödöllő as a coronation gift, and it became the one royal residence in which she was ever observed to be happy. Her reward was the crown of St. Stephen held above her head in the Matthias Church, and a settlement that bought the monarchy 51 more years. His wife had been 16 when he married her, and she is the reason most people have heard of him at all. She was born on Christmas Eve, 1837, in Munich, the 4th of 9 children of a Bavarian duke with a junior title, a great deal of land, a circus ring in his garden, and no interest whatsoever in court protocol. Her name was Elizabeth. Her family called her Cece. She grew up half wild, writing before she could properly write, and she had not been the intended bride. Her elder sister, Helene, had. The emperor's mother had arranged the whole thing at Bad Ischl in the summer of 1853, and the emperor, who had never in his life been permitted to want anything, took one look at the younger sister and said he would have her or nobody. They were married in Vienna on the 24th of April, 1854. She was 16 years and 4 months old. What happened next is the most exactly documented case in European history of a person being destroyed by an institution. The Spanish court ceremonial that governed the Habsburgs specified who might sit in her presence and who might not, at what hour she rose, who handed her which garment, and how many minutes a visit might last. Her ladies were chosen for her. Her letters were read. Her Bavarian dogs were removed. And when her children were born, Sophie in 1855, Gisela in 1856. Her mother-in-law took them, installed them in apartments near her own, appointed their nurses, and let their mother visit at fixed hours. In the summer of 1857, Elizabeth insisted on taking both little girls with her to Hungary against the advice of every doctor at court. Both fell ill on the journey. Gisela recovered. Sophie, who was 2, did not. She died in Buda, in a rented room with her mother beside her. Elizabeth never entirely returned from that room. She bore a son the following year, Rudolph the heir, born on the 21st of August, 1858, and handed him over without a fight because she had learned what fighting cost. Then she began to travel. For the next 40 years she was, in effect, absent. Madeira, Corfu, Ireland, England, for the hunting, where she rode to hounds with a recklessness that alarmed even the professionals. Hungary, which she loved and whose language she learned properly, and where she was genuinely popular in a way she never managed in Vienna. She built a villa on Corfu, tired of it, and put it up for sale. She had a system of exercise apparatus installed in her dressing room. She measured her waist daily and starved herself to keep it, in a regime that a modern physician would recognize immediately and which contemporaries described admiringly as discipline. Her hair, famously, obsessively, took 3 hours a day to dress, and she read Homer and Heine while it was being done. She was the most photographed woman in Europe, and after her 40th year she permitted no more portraits and no more photographs, and went out behind a fan or a leather parasol. What the world remembers as a face is a woman who stopped, at a certain point, agreeing to be looked at, and her husband, who loved her in his rigid, uncomprehending way, wrote to her almost every day of those 40 years and read her replies at his plain desk at 4 in the morning and got on with the files. There was one other person in his life, and the arrangement by which she arrived there says everything about that marriage. In the mid-1880s, the empress, who had no intention of returning to Vienna and a clear-eyed understanding of what she was leaving her husband to, selected an actress from the court theater named Katharina Schratt, commissioned a portrait of her, arranged the introductions, and effectively handed her the post. Schratt was 32, separated from her husband, warm, funny, and entirely without pretension, the one adult in the emperor's life who spoke to him as though he were a person rather than an office. The friendship lasted 30 years until his death. He bought her a villa near Schönbrunn and another at Bad Ischl, paid her gambling debts, and wrote her some 400 letters, of which a great many survive. They are full of the weather, his digestion, the tedium of state dinners, and the recurring, unmistakable note of a lonely man arranging to see someone who makes him laugh. What was in it beyond that, no document establishes, and the court, which gossiped about everything, was oddly quiet about this. The picture that emerges of the last decades is of a man living an existence of monastic regularity. Up before 4, the iron camp bed, the cold water, the plain tunic, the files, the audiences at which anyone in the empire might in theory appear before him for a few seconds, the walk in the garden, breakfast with an actress in a villa near the palace, and back to the files. He kept it up while his brother was executed in Mexico, while his son died at Meyerling, while his wife was killed in Geneva, and while the empire he had been raised to preserve unaltered dismantled itself around him in installments. In 1872, the Archduchess Sophie died, and the two women's war ended without either of them having won it. In 1877, Elizabeth gave up hunting. In 1881, the Crown Prince was married, at 23, to a Belgian princess of 16, and the marriage produced one daughter and then produced nothing at all. But before any of that, the family had already lost a son to an adventure so improbable that if it were fiction, no one would accept it. The emperor had a younger brother named Maximilian, born at Schönbrunn on the 6th of July, 1832, 2 years after him, the clever one, the liberal one, the one who read botany and wrote bad verse and commanded the Austrian navy with real ability. 2 years apart in age and a universe apart in temperament, the brothers were never comfortable with one another. Maximilian was given the governorship of Lombardy and Venetia, tried to rule it with a lightness of touch that Vienna found alarming, and was removed. He married Charlotte, the daughter of the King of the Belgians, a first-class mind, better educated than her husband and entirely aware of it, and built a white castle called Miramar on a rock above the Adriatic near Trieste, and settled there to be irrelevant. He was 31, with nothing to do, when the French emperor came to him with an offer. Napoleon III had invaded Mexico. The pretext was unpaid debt. The purpose was a French client state in the Americas at a moment when the United States, torn open by its own civil war, was in no condition to object. What was needed to make the arrangement respectable was a monarch, Catholic, European, with an old enough name to satisfy the Mexican conservatives who had asked for one, and not French, so that the whole thing would not look like what it was. A Habsburg archduke was precisely the article required. Maximilian hesitated for the better part of a year, and then accepted, on the strength of a plebiscite organized in Mexico by the French occupying army, whose result surprised nobody. Before he sailed, he was required to sign a family pact renouncing his rights of succession in Austria, his brother insisted, and the two men parted badly. He and Charlotte arrived at Veracruz in the spring of 1864. She became Carlota. He was 31, she was 23. They were, in the way of intelligent people who have been badly advised, entirely sincere. Maximilian confirmed the land reforms of the Republican government he had displaced, which appalled the conservatives who had invited him. He legislated maximum working hours and abolished debt peonage, which appalled the landowners who were paying for him. He wrote a court ceremonial of extraordinary length for a country in the middle of a war. He collected butterflies. Carlota, who had the better political instincts, toured the provinces, sat in council, and governed as regent while he traveled. None of it mattered to them because the arithmetic was never theirs. The empire existed only as long as the French army stood in it, and the French army was needed in Europe, where Prussia was becoming a problem. In 1866, Napoleon III began to withdraw. Carlotta sailed for Europe that summer to argue for her husband's throne. She got as far as St. Cloud, and Napoleon would not help her. She went to Rome and asked the Pope, and there, in the Vatican, in a state of terror that had passed beyond the reach of any argument, she collapsed. She believed she was being poisoned. She refused food that had not been prepared in front of her. She was taken from Rome to Miramar and then to Belgium, and she never went back to Mexico and never, in any sustained way, returned to herself. Her husband was urged to abdicate by everyone, including the emperor who had installed him. He refused, on the grounds that a Habsburg does not desert people who have trusted him, which was, depending on where one stands, either the only honorable sentence in the whole affair or the vanity that killed him. He fell back on the city of Querétaro in February 1867, sustained a siege for 10 weeks, attempted a breakout, and was captured on the 16th of May. He was tried by court-martial. Appeals for clemency arrived from half the crowned heads of Europe, and from Garibaldi, and from Victor Hugo. The president of the Mexican Republic, Benito Juarez, refused them all. The point of the proceeding, he understood perfectly, was to make it clear that Mexico was not a place where European princes could be installed as an experiment. Maximilian was executed on a hill outside Querétaro on the morning of the 19th of June, 1867. He was 34. His body was returned to Austria the following winter and laid in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna among his ancestors. Carlota lived on for 60 years. She was cared for at Bouchoux Castle near Brussels, in a household arranged by her family, and she died there on the 19th of January, 1927 at 86, outliving her husband, his brother, the empire he had refused to abandon, and the empire she had been born to serve. In her long seclusion, she is said to have continued to speak of her husband as though he were traveling and expected back. Whether it happened exactly so, no document confirms. What is certain is that she was never told, or never accepted, that the thing was finished. Vienna received the news of Querétaro in July 1867, 5 weeks after the emperor and empress had been crowned king and queen of Hungary. Franz Joseph made no public statement beyond the necessary. His mother, who had lost her favorite son, aged visibly and never recovered. That is the first of the deaths. There were 3 more, and they came at intervals of roughly a decade, like a clock striking. The second was the strangest, and it has never been fully explained. Rudolph, the crown prince, was 30 years old in the winter of 1889. His upbringing had begun badly. At 6, he was taken out of the nursery and handed to a general who believed that an heir to the throne should be hardened, and who set about it in ways that a modern reader will recognize instantly as abuse. The child was woken at night by pistol shots outside his window to accustom him to alarm, left alone in the game park in the dark, drilled in the cold until he was ill. It went on for a year. It was the one occasion on which his mother intervened in the raising of her own children, and she did it by giving her husband a written ultimatum. The boy's tutor goes, or she does, the tutor went. His replacement was a liberal, well-read soldier named Latour, and under him, the child became a young man of unusual intellectual quality, with a real command of the natural sciences and an honorary doctorate from the University of Vienna for his work on birds. He also became something no Habsburg heir had been before, a working writer of the opposition. From the 1880s, he supplied anonymous political articles to the leading liberal newspaper in Vienna, edited by a Jewish journalist named Moritz Seps, with whom he corresponded for years about the reform of the monarchy, the abolition of noble tax exemptions, a coalition that could hold the nationalities together by consent rather than by garrison, and the growing danger, as he saw it, of a foreign policy written in Berlin. His father knew about none of it, or affected not to. The two men could not discuss anything. The emperor gave his son ceremonial commands and no responsibility, and the son wrote to his editor at night, and the empire went on being governed by the files. His marriage had failed early and comprehensively. His health, by that winter, had been poor for some time, and he was drinking and taking morphine, and the doctors who saw him privately were saying so to each other and to nobody else. On the 29th of January, there was a family dinner in Vienna. Rudolph excused himself, saying he was unwell, and went out to Meierling, a hunting lodge he had bought in the Vienna woods 2 years before, with a shooting party arranged for the following morning. There was a young woman with him, a baroness of 17 named Mary Vetsera, whose mother had actively encouraged the affair, and whose family would spend the rest of their lives paying for it. On the morning of the 30th of January, the valet could not wake him. The door would not give. When it was forced, both of them were dead. What the court did next is more revealing than the event. The first bulletin said heart failure. The second admitted a different account. The young woman's body was removed from the lodge in secret that night, taken to the abbey at Heiligenkreuz, and buried before dawn with almost no one present. Her name was struck from the records so thoroughly that for decades it was possible to read official accounts of the crown prince's death in which she does not appear at all. Letters were written and destroyed. A police file was closed and reopened and closed again. Historians have argued for 130 years about what happened in that room, and they are still arguing. And the honest position is that the documentary trail was deliberately broken by people who had every reason to break it. What is not in doubt is the arithmetic. The emperor had one son. After the 30th of January, 1889, he had none. Elizabeth was in Vienna when the news came. She was the one who had to tell the emperor's mother-in-law. She was the one who received the Vetsera girl's mother, who came to the Hofburg to plead for her daughter's name and was refused. From that winter, she wore black and did not take it off. She had worn mourning before, at intervals, in the theatrical way that suited her. This was different. The traveling, which had been an escape, became a condition. She moved between hotels under an assumed name, the Countess of Hohenems, with a small suite and a lady-in-waiting, and stayed nowhere long. In September 1898, she was in Geneva. She had been warned. The Austrian legation had reported that anarchist circles in Switzerland were discussing attacks on crowned heads, and had recommended a police escort, and she had refused it, as she had refused every escort for 20 years. She was 60 years old. She was staying at a hotel on the lake under her assumed name, and a local newspaper had printed the fact that the elegant Hungarian countess in the corner suite was in fact the Empress of Austria. On the afternoon of the 10th, she left the hotel on foot with her lady-in-waiting, Countess Storey, to catch the steamer to Montreux. She disliked processions and had insisted on walking. On the promenade, a young Italian laborer named Lucchini came at her out of the crowd. He was 25. He had come to Geneva to kill a French prince who had left the city and had chosen her, more or less at random, because a newspaper had told him she was there. He said afterwards that he had resolved to kill the first titled person he met. She got up. That is the detail that stays. She got up, thanked the people who had come to help her, retrieved her hat, and walked the remaining 100 meters to the boat, and told her lady-in-waiting she was quite all right. It was only when the steamer had pulled away from the quay that she collapsed. The captain turned the boat back. She was carried up to her hotel room on an improvised stretcher, and she died there in the early afternoon without regaining consciousness. She was brought home by train and buried in the Capuchin crypt on the 17th of September, among the Habsburg dead, in the same vault as her son. Her husband was told at Schönbrunn. He is reported to have said that no one would ever know how much he had loved her, a sentence which, if he said it, is the single most emotional statement recorded of him in 86 years, and which he never repeated. He went back to the desk. There were files. The strangest thing about the last stretch of Franz Joseph's reign is how well the empire looked from the outside, while the family inside it was disintegrating. Vienna in those years was the most intellectually alive city in Europe. Freud in the Berggasse, Mahler at the Opera House, Klimt in the Secession, Luce in his plain facades, Schnitzler's plays, and Karl Kraus's journalism, and the coffee houses where all of them abused one another. The Ringstrasse was finished. The empire had 11 official nationalities, a dozen languages of instruction, an efficient postal service, and a parliament in which the deputies periodically threw inkwells. It is worth being precise about what that empire actually was, because the word suggests something more coherent than the reality. A single monarch ruled Austrians, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ruthenians, Slovenes, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, and Italians, in a state where the army gave its orders in a vocabulary of about 80 German words that every recruit was drilled to understand regardless of what he spoke at home. Trains ran from Krakow to Trieste, from Prague to the Adriatic. A postal official could be transferred from Bukovina to the Tyrol and find the same forms on the same desk. And the arrangement worked, after a fashion, for exactly as long as the peoples inside it believed there was no better available alternative. The thing which was steadily removing that belief was not oppression. It was the 19th century's most contagious idea, that the natural unit of political life is the nation, and that a nation ought to have a state. Against that idea, a multinational dynastic monarchy had no argument at all, only a dynasty and a crypt and the habit of obedience. And at the top of it sat an old man in a plain tunic who had lost his brother, his son, and his wife, and who now had to make an heir out of a nephew he could not stand. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was born at Graz on the 18th of December, 1863, the son of the emperor's younger brother, Karl Ludwig. After Meerling, he was second in line. After his father's death in 1896, he was first. He was abrupt, suspicious, short-tempered, a compulsive hunter who kept written totals of the game he shot, and he had a genuine and unpopular political idea that the dual arrangement of 1867 was strangling the empire, and that the Slavic populations, Czechs, Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, would have to be given a share of power or would eventually take it. This made him hated in Budapest and distrusted in Vienna, and, as it turned out, dangerous to precisely the people who would kill him. And he was in love with a woman who could not be his wife. Sophie Chotek was born at Stuttgart on the 1st of March, 1868, the daughter of a Bohemian count in the diplomatic service, noble, respectable, and by the rules of the House of Habsburg, unacceptable. The family statutes required that a spouse come from a reigning or formerly reigning dynasty. The Choteks had never reigned over anything. She was a lady-in-waiting in the household of an archduchess, which was how they met, and when the connection was discovered, the archduchess dismissed her. He would not give her up, and he would not marry anyone else, and the standoff lasted years. The emperor gave way at last in the summer of 1900, on terms. On the 28th of June, Franz Ferdinand swore on the Bible, in the presence of the court and the ministers of both halves of the monarchy, that his marriage would be morganatic. His wife would not share his rank, and no child of theirs would ever inherit the throne. 3 days later, on the 1st of July, they were married at Reichstadt in Bohemia. The emperor did not attend, nor did any archduke. They had 3 children, and, by every account that survives, a happy marriage of the kind almost nobody in that family managed. They lived mostly at Konopishcha in Bohemia, where he laid out the rose garden, and she raised the children away from Vienna. And in Vienna, she was made to pay for it in the small and endless coin of protocol. She could not sit beside her husband at table, could not ride in his carriage, could not enter a room on his arm, had to walk into court functions last, behind every archduchess in the building, including girls of 17. There was exactly one context in which the rules did not apply. On a military inspection, in his capacity as Inspector General of the Armed Forces, the Archduke's wife could ride at his side. That is why she was in the car with him on the 28th of June, 1914. It was their 14th wedding anniversary. It was also, in the Serbian calendar, St. Vitus's Day, the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, which no one in the Austrian planning staff appears to have considered. They drove into Sarajevo in an open motor car. The first attempt on them that morning failed. The Archduke went on to the town hall and made a speech, and then insisted on visiting the hospital to see an officer wounded in the earlier attack, and the driver, who had not been told the route had changed, turned into a side street and stopped to reverse. Gavrilo Princip, 19 years old, was standing on the pavement. Both of them were dead within minutes. Sophie first, the Archduke a little after. His last recorded words were to his wife, asking her not to die, telling her to live for the children. Because she was morganatic, the court had a problem even in death. The 2 coffins lay in state for a few hours only, hers a step lower than his, with her white gloves and black fans set upon it to mark her rank. There was no grand state funeral. They were taken by night to Archstetten, the castle he had chosen years before for precisely this reason, because the imperial crypt in Vienna would not have received her. 5 weeks later, the empire declared war on Serbia, and the alliances did what alliances are for. It is worth stopping for a moment on what the old emperor did in those weeks, because it is the last decision of the last man who governed the way his ancestors had governed. He was 83. He had not liked his nephew. He had spent 66 years on the throne trying to preserve an inheritance by refusing to change it, and every time he had been forced to change it, in 1859, in 1866, in 1867, the change had been imposed on him by a defeat. His ministers came to him with a document to be signed, and the argument that the monarchy's prestige could not survive the murder of an heir, and he signed it. The manifesto he issued to his peoples began with the words that everything had been considered, that he had weighed it before God. It is a dignified document, and it set light to the century. What followed does not belong to the story of a family, and this film will not pretend to tell it. The empire fought for 4 years on 3 fronts. Its armies were multilingual in a way that no other force in the war was, with commands issued in German to men who spoke Czech, Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, Croatian, Ruthenian, Italian. Its officer corps was destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again. Its supply system failed, and by the last winter the cities of the interior were hungry in a way that the empire's administrators had no experience of managing. The details are a matter for other histories. What matters here is that the war finished the House of Habsburg, and that it did so in a manner none of them anticipated, not by defeat in the field alone, but by making it obvious to the peoples of the monarchy that they did not need it. Franz Joseph did not see the end. He caught a cold in November 1916, and it went to his lungs. He worked at the desk until the evening of the 21st, gave instructions to be woken early because he had not finished, and died that night at Schönbrunn, in the palace where he had been born 86 years before. He had reigned for 68 years. There was scarcely a person left in the empire who could remember another head of state. The family had, by then, been bearing itself in the same manner for 300 years. And the manner is worth describing because nothing else the Habsburgs did says as plainly what they believed about themselves. The body went to the Capuchin church in the middle of Vienna, into a vault beneath the floor, in a metal sarcophagus among 140-odd others. The heart went in a silver urn to a small chamber in the Augustinian church a few streets away, where the urns stand in rows on shelves behind an iron grill like preserves in a cellar. The remaining viscera went in a copper vessel to the catacombs beneath St. Stephen's Cathedral. 3 churches, 3 parts, 1 person, a body of state distributed among the institutions that had made it. The funeral itself was the last great imperial ceremony in European history, and watched now on the flickering film that it survives, it has the quality of a thing that already knows it is finished. The black horses, the plumes, the long, slow file into the Capuchin church. And at the door, the ancient ritual in which the herald knocks and asks admittance for the emperor with all his titles, and is refused, and knocks and asks admittance for Franz Joseph, Emperor of Austria and Apostolic King of Hungary, and is refused, and knocks a 3rd time and asks admittance for a poor sinner, and the door is opened. The man who walked behind the coffin was 29 years old. Karl had been born on the 17th of August, 1887, at a castle on the Danube, the son of an archduke of the collateral line who had not expected his family to matter. He was a serious, devout, rather gentle man, trained as a cavalry officer, and until the murders at Sarajevo, nobody had considered that he might reign. He had married on the 21st of October, 1911, a princess of the dispossessed house of Bourbon-Parma named Zita, the 17th of her father's 24 children, raised between a villa in Tuscany and a castle in Lower Austria, educated by nuns on the Isle of Wight, fluent in 5 languages and better at politics than her husband. The story the family kept is that after the ceremony, the old emperor took the young couple aside and told them that the crown would come to them sooner than anyone expected, and that they should prepare. Whether he used those words, no document confirms. It was, in any case, obvious. They were crowned in Budapest at the end of December 1916, in a ceremony that the government insisted on holding despite the war and the shortages. The last coronation of a king of Hungary, performed by a man who was already trying to work out how to end the war he had inherited. That was the whole of his reign, in effect, an attempt to make peace conducted from a position of no strength whatsoever. He tried it through the family. Zita had 2 brothers, princes of Bourbon-Parma, serving as officers in the Belgian army. Through them, in 1917, Karl opened a secret channel to the French president and, through him, to London. He offered terms. He indicated that Austria would support French claims in Alsace and Lorraine, a concession that, if it became public, would end the alliance with Berlin overnight. It became public the following spring when the French premier, in the middle of a diplomatic quarrel, produced the letter. Karl denied it. The letter was in his handwriting. He was obliged to travel to German headquarters and submit to an arrangement which placed the Austro-Hungarian armies under effective German command, and the little authority he still possessed drained out of him in a fortnight. Zita, who had encouraged the initiative, was blamed for it in the Viennese press with a viciousness that had a familiar shape. She was Italian by birth, she was French by ancestry, she was a woman, and the empire was losing. They called her the Bourbon spy for the rest of her life. In October 1918, with the armies dissolving and national councils declaring themselves in Prague, Zagreb, and Budapest, Karl issued a manifesto offering to reconstitute the Austrian half of the monarchy as a federation of peoples. It was a serious proposal. 20 years earlier, it might have worked. It arrived after the Allies had already recognized the independence of the states it proposed to federate, and the effect of it, in practice, was to give every nationality in the empire official permission to leave. They left within 3 weeks. On the 11th of November 1918, at Schönbrunn, Karl signed a document that had been drafted with great care by lawyers on both sides. He did not abdicate. He renounced all participation in the affairs of state and acknowledged in advance whatever form of government German Austria might choose for itself. The distinction mattered enormously to him and to his wife, and it would shape the rest of both their lives. He had been crowned before God. A man might withdraw from government, but he could not resign a sacrament. Zita is said to have put it more bluntly, that a sovereign can be deposed and never abdicates. The Republic was proclaimed the next day. 2 days later, the family left Schönbrunn. The emperor, the empress, and the children, the eldest of them a boy of 6, in a line of motor cars at night by a side gate. There were no crowds. The staff who saw them off had been told nothing. They went first to a hunting lodge at Eckartsau in the flat country east of Vienna and spent the winter there, cold and short of food, watched by the new government and increasingly aware that they were hostages of a sort. In March 1919, a British officer arranged their departure to Switzerland by train, an act of some personal decency, since his instructions were unclear and his government's position was that the matter was Austria's business. 2 weeks later, the Austrian parliament passed the Habsburg law. It dissolved the imperial house, expelled its members from the country, confiscated the family's property outright, and made the return of any Habsburg conditional on a formal renunciation of all claims. The palaces, the Hofburg, Schönbrunn, the estates, the picture collections, all of it became the property of the Republic. The family kept what it had carried out. What it had carried out was a suitcase. In Switzerland, Karl made 2 attempts to recover the Hungarian throne, in the spring and the autumn of 1921. The second nearly worked. He flew into Hungary in an aircraft, gathered loyal officers and a small force, and reached the outskirts of Budapest before the regent, Admiral Horthy, who governed a kingdom without a king and had no intention of acquiring one, stopped him. There was a brief and confused engagement in which Hungarians fired on Hungarians. Karl ordered his men to stand down rather than continue it. He was arrested, held for a fortnight in an abbey, and handed over to the Allies. The great powers had had enough. They chose the most remote place under a friendly flag that could be reached without crossing a hostile border. And in November 1921, a British warship carried the last emperor and empress of Austria to the island of Madeira. They had no money. The states that had inherited the empire declined to pay a pension to a man who had twice tried to reclaim a throne. For a few months, they lived in a hotel in Funchal on credit, and when the credit ran out, a local family offered them the use of a house higher up the mountain, at Monte, above the town. It was a summer villa. It had no heating. The winter fog came up the slope every afternoon and stood in the rooms, and the walls sweated. In March 1922, Karl walked down into Funchal to buy a toy for one of the children and came back up in the cold and caught a chill that turned into pneumonia. There were no antibiotics. He was ill for a fortnight. Zita, who was pregnant with their 8th child, sat with him throughout. He died on the 1st of April, 1922, at Monte, on the island of Madeira, in a rented house belonging to strangers. He was 34 years old. He had reigned for 2 years and had been in exile for 3, and there was no country in Europe that would accept his body for burial. He is still there, in a chapel on the mountain, where he is a local saint and something of a curiosity, and where the family goes on the 1st of April. His widow was 29. She put on black on the day he died and wore it for 67 years. What Zita did next is the least famous and possibly the most impressive part of this entire story. She had 8 children, no money, no property, no state, and no legal standing anywhere. She had also, by temperament and upbringing, absolute confidence that the position she held was real. She took the family to Spain, where a cousin king lent them a palace at Lacatio on the Basque coast. When the Spanish monarchy fell, she took them to Belgium. When the German army came into Belgium, she took them, by way of Portugal in a ship out of Lisbon, to the United States. She spent the war years in North America, latterly in Quebec, in a rented house with 4 of her children studying at the university at Laval, doing what she could, and what she could do turned out to be more than a stateless widow might expect. She had access. She wrote to the American president. She lobbied, with limited success, for a post-war Central European settlement that would not simply hand the region to whichever great power got there first. She was courteous, indefatigable, and entirely uninterested in being told that her cause was finished. She was also, in her own understanding, still the Empress of Austria, and she brought her children up to know exactly what that meant and exactly what it now cost. Her eldest son later described a childhood in which the family fortune consisted of the education their mother insisted on and the languages. The Austrian Republic did not permit her to enter the country for 60 years. The law required a renunciation, and she would not make one. And so, decade after decade, she lived within sight of a border she could not cross. In Luxembourg, in Belgium, finally in a house run by nuns at Zeisers, in the Swiss canton of Grisons, in two plainly furnished rooms. The government relented at last in 1982. She was 90 years old. She flew to Vienna, attended Mass at St. Stephen's, and came out of the cathedral into a crowd of thousands of people who had turned out to see a woman most of them had been born too late to remember. She went back several times after that. She gave an interview on Austrian television. She had outlived the republic that expelled her, the two dictatorships that followed it, and very nearly the division of Europe that came after them. She died at Zeisers on the 14th of March, 1989, at 96. They buried her in Vienna on the 1st of April, the anniversary, chosen deliberately, of her husband's death 67 years before on the mountain above Funchal. The streets were full. The cathedral held 8,000 people and turned away more. Delegations came in national dress from every territory the monarchy had once contained, several of which were, that spring, still on the other side of the Iron Curtain and would not be for much longer. Her coffin was covered with the funeral pall that had been used for Maria Theresa. And at the door of the Capuchin church, the herald knocked and asked admittance for Zita, Empress of Austria and Apostolic Queen of Hungary, with the full recitation of titles that had not legally existed for 70 years, and was refused, and knocked again with the shorter list, and was refused, and knocked a third time and asked admittance for Zita, a mortal, sinful woman, and the door was opened. The boy who had walked behind his great-great-uncle's coffin in 1916, holding his mother's hand in a white coat, lived until 19 months into the second decade of the 21st century. Otto was born on the 20th of November, 1912, at a house in the lower Austrian hills. He was 4 when he became heir to the throne of a great empire, 6 when the empire ceased to exist, and 9 when his father died in the fog above Funchal, and he became, in the family's understanding, its head. He was educated in Spain and Belgium. He took a doctorate in political and social sciences at Louvain, and he spent his 20s as the improbable figurehead of a monarchist movement in a country he was not allowed to enter. In the winter of 1938, he wrote to the Austrian chancellor offering to come home and take over the government as a demonstration against the annexation that everyone could see coming. It was an absurd offer and a serious one, and it was overtaken within weeks. When German troops crossed the border in March, the Nazi Party press printed a notice against him by name. He left Europe, made his way to the United States, and spent the war as a publicist and a lobbyist for the idea that Austria had been a victim rather than a participant, a claim which was convenient for a good many people afterwards, and which historians have been picking apart ever since. And then, in a turn that nobody in 1945 would have predicted, the last Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary became one of the more effective backbench politicians in Western Europe. He renounced his claim to the Austrian throne in 1961 because that was the price of being allowed to enter the country, and the renunciation caused a political crisis in Vienna that lasted years and nearly brought down the governing coalition. Such was the residual voltage in the name. He took German citizenship, and in 1979, at the first direct election to the European Parliament, he was returned as a member for Bavaria and served for 20 years. The gesture he is remembered for was made in his first session. He had an empty chair placed in the chamber to stand for the countries of Central and Eastern Europe that had no representatives to send, and he referred to it and to them at every opportunity for a decade while nobody in Brussels or Strasbourg believed the situation would change in his lifetime. On the 19th of August, 1989, he was the patron of a picnic. It was held at Sopron on the Hungarian side of the Austrian border, and it was organized by Hungarian opposition activists with his name attached to it as cover. A border gate was to be opened for 3 hours as a symbolic gesture. Word had circulated among the East German holidaymakers camped around Lake Balaton, and when the gate opened, several hundred of them walked through it into Austria, and the Hungarian guards, who had been given no instructions to shoot and did not want any, stood aside and let them go. The Berlin Wall came down 11 weeks later. Otto von Habsburg left the parliament in 1999 and died at his house in Bavaria on the 4th of July, 2011 at 98. He was buried in Vienna on the 16th. The cortege took the old route through the Ringstrasse. The streets were closed. The cathedral was full. At the door of the Capuchin church, the herald knocked, and the whole absurd, magnificent, unanswerable list of titles was read out one last time. Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Bohemia, Dalmatia, Croatia, Galicia, Grand Duke of Tuscany, Duke of Auschwitz and Zator, Prince of Trent, and the door stayed shut. And it stayed shut for Otto von Habsburg, Doctor of Political Science, member of the European Parliament, and it opened, as it always opens, for a mortal and sinful man. His heart was taken to an abbey in Hungary, according to a custom the family had kept for 400 years. The house did not end with him. There are Habsburgs living in Austria today, several hundred of them, working as one would expect the descendants of any old European family to work, in law, in business, in cultural foundations, in the protection of heritage sites, in motor racing. They are private citizens under Austrian law. They may not use their titles, and the properties their great-grandparents left in 1918 belong to the Republic and are open to the public for the price of a ticket, which brings this story back, at the end, to where it started. The tower above the river area is still there. It is smaller than the imagination expects. A squat keep of gray stone on a wooded slope in the Swiss canton of Aargau, with a restaurant on the ground floor and a view over farmland toward the German border. It costs nothing to walk up to it. Most of the people who do so are hikers who have stopped for lunch, and a certain number of them work out from the plaque that this was the beginning of it, that the family which took its name from this building went on to hold Spain and the Americas, Naples and Milan, Bohemia and Hungary, and the Netherlands, and the imperial crown of the German nation for 400 years, and to marry into every reigning house in Europe, and to end in a rented villa on a fog-bound mountain, in a house belonging to strangers, with a widow of 29 and its children in a suitcase. They were not overthrown by a rival dynasty. No conqueror took the crown from them. What happened in the end was that the peoples inside the arrangement decided that they preferred to be Czechs and Poles and Hungarians and Croats rather than subjects of a house. And once that decision had been taken, there was nothing in the whole apparatus of protocol, precedence, mourning, and marriage that could hold them. The family's own explanation for its survival had always been the marriages. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. It worked for 600 years, and it is worth noticing what it actually meant. It meant that in every generation, a girl of 15 or 16 was placed on a road to a country whose language she did not speak, to a man she had met once, in order that a border might move without an army. Sometimes she governed brilliantly. Sometimes she was destroyed. The method never distinguished between the two outcomes because the method was not about her. Maria Theresa understood this and used it and mourned her husband for 15 years. Elizabeth never accepted it and spent 40 years traveling away from a palace she could not live in. Charlotte accepted a crown in a country she had never seen and lost her reason at 26 and lived to 86. Sophie Chotek walked into every room in Vienna behind girls half her age and was permitted to sit beside her husband on exactly the sort of occasion that killed her. Zita, who married into the family 8 years before it fell and outlived nearly everyone who had ever curtsied to her, wore black for 67 years for a man who had been emperor for 2. The empire is gone. The palaces are museums. The crypt beneath the Capuchin church in Vienna holds around 150 of them, emperors and empresses and children who did not survive their second winter. And it is open on weekday afternoons, and the guides are careful to point out that the newest tombs are the plainest. Some houses, in the end, are remembered less for the empires they assembled than for the private lives those empires quietly spent.